Hello, Bio30. Welcome to the video on Reflex Arc. Today, we are going to talk about and connect the muscle contraction video you watched, and we're going to relate it back to the nervous system. So we're going to take a chapter from Bio 20 and mesh it with something that we are now learning in Bio 30. We are going to describe what is a reflex arc, how it works, and we're going to start using the language of sensory receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and effector. You will also see the word affector when we talk about reflex arcs. We're also going to distinguish the difference between gray matter and white matter found in your central nervous system. So let's start off in your notes talking about what is a reflex arc. So in simplest forms, a reflex arc is a neural pathway that contains about 5 components, which are the sensory receptors, or what I said is that affector, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and an effector. Okay. Now, we need to define some of these words. So a sensory receptor would be something like your eye, your fingers, okay, your tongue, okay? Those are your affectors. The neurons below it are the sensory neurons that are carrying that information from whatever you touch, taste, smell, saw, and carrying it to your interneurons. Your interneurons are found mostly in your spinal cord. Now, when we talk about a reflex arc, it is very, very important that you understand that reflexes happen without our brain really being involved in the process. The reflex response goes straight to our spinal cord for a very, very quick reaction. Okay. And then our brain processes it all after. So if you think about you're walking around and you didn't realize the stove was on and you touched it, the top of the stove, your hand pulls away before you register pain. And that is a reflex. It is your job of your body to protect everything that you are. So what it does is a reflex is there to protect you. It's there to keep you away from harm. So the interneuron within a reflex arc is actually there to process everything, but it's just for your spinal cord. So again, allowing for that quick reflex reaction. The motor neuron would be the one carrying it down to the effector, which the effectors are going to be your muscles or your glands, and we'll talk about that. So again, my examples are like touching a hot stove, or if you're cut off. Okay, so you're driving along, someone swerves in front of you, and you swerve to kind of get out of their way. It's a natural reaction. Reflex arcs, we have tons of them, and we're going to do a couple of examples in a lab later on. So let's talk about the steps that are involved in a motor neuron. So the steps involved is just follow along with the 5 steps. We're going to draw a picture of it here in a minute. So the first thing you need to know is that your sensory receptor, or AKA your affector, receives some sort of information from the environment and initiates an impulse to the sensory neuron. We're going to really dive into how impulses work here in a tiny bit, but essentially you just need to know sensory receptor passes information to sensory neurons. So fingers to the neurons underneath, eyes to the neuron, the nerve at the back of your eye, called your optic nerve, those kinds of things. From there, this sensory neuron carries the impulse directly to the spinal cord. So again, a reflex arc carries it to the spinal cord. Anything else we do when you move your hands, when you're talking, I'm a big hand talker, for example, that's processed in your brain. But a reflex arc is processed at the spinal cord for a very, very quick reaction. So the sensory neuron carries it to the spinal cord, which is full of interneurons. The interneurons in your spinal cord interpret this signal and choose the appropriate manner to send it. So which motor neuron are you going to send it down? Okay, that's what it has to choose to do. The signal travels through the motor neuron and ends up at the effector, the muscle reflex. So it can either be muscle contraction, gland secretions for hormones and stuff like that. We're going to talk mostly about obvious ones that are muscle contractions because we can see those. We can't see our glands secrete hormones. So when we talk about reflexes, we really focus on the ones that we can see visibly. So those are the 5 steps that you need to get into your notes to make sure that you have to understand the process of a reflex arc. So now I want to draw a reflex arc in your notes. You don't have to draw this picture exactly. You could just draw it as a step-by-step process going around in a circle. Or if you're like to doodle and sketch, please feel free to draw this whole thing. So pretend you're going to the doctor. I think most of you have gone to the doctor at some point in your life. And that doctor, I don't know if they still do it, but they pull out their little tiny black mallet you can see there, and they're going to hit your knee. And what the response they're looking for is, does your bottom half of your leg, your calf muscle and everything, raise up? So it has to start with the affector, which are the touch receptors in the knee that takes on the impulse. So the doctor hits the knee, okay, that affector or sensory receptor takes on that beautiful touch and passes it along. So the very first one is you're starting with your sensory neuron. Okay, so we don't have one here, so it's going to be somewhere in here, sensory neuron. Then what happens is your sensory neuron sends the information up the leg to the spinal cord via the sensory nerves. Okay, so you can draw something along those lines. The interneuron, which is the spinal cord right here, interprets that impulse, sends it to the motor neuron, which you can see here. So it goes up the sensory neuron into the spinal cord, back down to the motor neuron, where the impulse is sent from the spinal cord to the leg muscle. And then lastly, the effector, which is the muscle that's actually trying to contract, okay, will move your leg. So that is drawing the diagram of the reflex arc. You can draw it exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like this, or you could draw the picture and label the picture, whichever you feel helps you remember best. But you also need to know the steps involved and the process. We are going to now talk about gray matter versus white matter. So you have a picture in your notes that shows a picture of a spinal cord. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord. And you can see on the outside here that the outside of the spinal cord, it almost looks clear, but it's not. We'll talk about that. It looks a little different than the inside of the spinal cord. And that's because the outer portion, which is kind of white in color, is called the white matter. It's the outer portion. It's myelinated neurons. Now, if you remember back from when we talked about neurons, myelination means that you can move an impulse faster, but it also means that you can regenerate. So white matter, or the outer portion, is known as myelinated neurons. And the reason why it's white is because it's like a fatty protein, and the fats in it take on that whitish color. So again, we call it myelinated. The other part of the inner darker shape, or the H shape, as you can see kind of on here, is what we would call the gray matter. And gray matter is unmyelinated, meaning it does not have myelin protecting the axon. So what we learned earlier is that myelinated means to protect and can slowly regenerate it. Unmyelinated means that you cannot regenerate any nerve that has no myelin on it. So if you sever a nerve without myelin on it, you will never get that nerve to function again. So there's my white matter, and there's my gray matter. I should go back. Please make sure you label the white matter and gray matter on your picture and fill in the notes about it. So this picture here you don't have in your notes. I just want to quickly speak about it because I think it's very important for you guys to understand when we're saying gray matter versus white matter. So you can see the brain and the spinal cord here and here. But what you can also see is from the spinal cord are a lot of nerves that are running off of the spinal cord. You have your lumbar spinal nerves, your sacral spinal nerves, which is found near your tailbone. The middle of your back is thoracic. Your upper part is cervical. So you have all these nerves that run off of your spinal cord down to your fingers, down to your toes, your legs, all over the place. The nerves that are found in your arms and your legs are myelinated because they are located on the outer portion of your spinal cord. Here. They're located on the outside. They come off of here. The spinal cord itself down the center is unmyelinated. Okay, so it's full of gray matter. Now, what happens is sometimes people can get in accidents or have some sort of injury occur where it severs their spinal cord. Okay, so severing the spinal cord, let's say, pretend here. Okay, what ends up happening is because they have severed their spinal cord and gone through both the white matter and the gray matter, they will never have regeneration in that area or anywhere down from there. Okay. So what that means is someone, if they have a spinal injury low enough, they may be what we call paraplegic, meaning they can't use their legs, or they will be quadriplegic if they can't use their arms and their legs. What ends up happening is because the signal can't be passed through from the brain down the spinal cord, you lose the function of the nerves that come off of your spinal cord. But the cool thing about the brain is where all the responses of the autonomic nervous system occur. So such as breathing, heart rate, digestion movements like peristalsis. So even though you have severing of the spinal cord, your brain still keeps your body functioning, but you just can't move. And currently, there's no scientific remedy or cure to help with spinal injuries. There's things like stem cell research that they're looking at and things like that to try and do regeneration of the spinal cord. But so far, there's nothing that will fix a spinal cord injury. All right. That being said, up here is what we would call your brain stem. And in your brain stem is where your medulla oblongata is located. That's where you have your autonomic responses. In movies, when you see someone break someone's neck, it has nothing to do with the fact that they broke their neck and now at all. If someone severs their spinal cord in their neck low enough, they would just be quadriplegic, meaning they couldn't use their arms and legs because all the nerves below that are no longer functional. If someone breaks their neck, it's usually because they're severing the brain stem, which is where the medulla is located, which is where your autonomic responses are. Your breathing, your heart rate, those kinds of things. So if you sever that and your brain can't pass that information to your body, that is why you would break someone's neck and they would die. Okay, so gray matter versus white matter. White matter can regenerate, so that's the nerves here. You can get feeling back in your nerves eventually over a long period of time. It's not instantaneous, it takes a long time. But gray matter, which is the center of your spinal cord, will never regenerate. So let's look finally at the connection between muscle contractions and nerve impulses. We're taking bio 20 muscles and melding it with a nerve impulse. It's really important to understand that there are a lot of connections when we talk about bio, especially in the human systems. So we've already gone through and talking about how we get a reflex. So a sensory receptor passes information to a sensory neuron, which passes it to our interneuron, which is in our brain or in our spinal cord. And then that motor neuron passes it to the effector. Now, in this case, this set of steps could be an example of a regular muscle contraction. It doesn't necessarily have to go through our spinal cord. This could be a process in our brain. We want to write something, so we want our arm to move. Okay. Our sensory receptor sees the pen, our sensory neuron passes that information to our brain. Our brain says, go pick up the pen, we pick up the pen. If it's a reflex, that interneuron is going to be a spinal cord interneuron. So once we get to the part where the effector is, the muscle has to contract. And so in order to move your muscles, especially in like a reflex arc where it's a quick jerk, these are the processes that have to happen. Calcium, which is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or yes, I believe. Calcium is released into the muscle, which attaches to troponin. Troponin is on top of tropomyosin, so tropomyosin is removed, and the myosin head attaches to the actin. So that's the pink is the myosin, and the blue is the actin in the little diagram you're seeing along the sides here. So myosin attaches to actin and flexes, which then pulls it to the center. We then use ATP, which is created by cellular respiration inside the muscle at the mitochondria, to pull the myosin head from the actin and repeat the process again. So the myosin head will attach further down the actin, and we will have a muscle contraction. So if you think about when you touch a hot stove, how fast that muscle moves, think of how fast this process has to occur. So hopefully in this lesson, you learned a couple of things: how muscle contraction relates to the nervous system, how a reflex arc works, and our vocab words of sensory or affector receptors, sensory neurons, interneurons, motor neurons, and effectors. And hopefully you understand the difference now between gray and white matter. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.